we might get started. So welcome. First of all, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So I will begin today acknowledging that we're facilitating this webinar from all sorts of places, but for me today from the lands of the Kaurna people. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from those joining us from around the country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend our respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples joining our webinar today. I can see lots of people joining now, so thanks everyone for popping in. So look, welcome everyone. This is obviously our next instalment of the DVE webinar series that we've been running this year. Thank you to everyone who's been supporting them. We're seeing a growing crowd every time, which is fantastic. Today we will be looking at navigating third-party and transnational education management, and I will introduce our subject matter experts and speakers shortly. So today we'll be covering a number of things. We'll be looking at understanding the landscape of third-party collaborations in the education sector, some of the best practices for establishing and maintaining successful partnerships, quality assurance and accreditation aspects to ensure educational excellence, and then mitigating risks and ensuring compliance with international standards. So quite a bit to cover there. To introduce, I'll run around and introduce everyone. So to start with, for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Carly Boone. I'm the engagement manager at DVE. You can see a lot of familiar names popping in there. And I'd like to introduce some of our speakers today. So today joining us is Emeritus Professor Robert Elliott. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Carly.
Robert is a senior consultant and member of DVE's governance and compliance team with over 26 years of senior leadership experience at the University of Sunshine Coast. And Robert has worked during his professional life as an academic in philosophy and as a senior executive, specifically as the Pro-Vice Chancellor International and Quality and acting Vice Chancellor at USC. Robert has significant experience, as you can imagine, through those roles across operational planning, leading organisational change, leading internationalisation, including the development of international partnerships, ensuring HESF and ESOS compliance, and leading the related registration engagements with TEXA. So thank you, Robert. Very valuable background there for our topics today. Also welcome to Emeritus Professor Jane Summers. Jane has extensive experience in senior university roles developing strategy and implementing organisational and process change, with her most recent roles as MBA Program Director and Deputy Chair of the Academic Board at Uni SQ. Jane has a background in marketing and executive education and is an experienced educator, student mentor and coach. During her time as MBA Program Director, Jane has managed multiple third-party agreement partnerships and has first-hand operational insight into the quality and management of these. So thanks, Jane, and welcome.
Thanks, Carly, and welcome to everybody.
And finally, welcome to Professor Meredith Lawley, who joins us as well today. Meredith is currently an adjunct professor marketing in the School of Business and Creative Industries at the University of Sunshine Coast. In addition, Meredith undertakes consultancy work specialising in higher education quality assurance. Meredith has over 30 years experience in faculty level management roles, including responsibility for the design and delivery of courses of both undergraduate and postgraduate levels in multiple modes. Meredith has served as an expert for government education accreditation bodies, including the Queensland Office of Higher Education, and Meredith is also a registered TEXA expert. So thank you, Meredith, for your time today.
Thanks, Carly. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us. We will run through a number of things today. Thank you to everyone who submitted some questions beforehand. We've managed to work most of the themes in, I think. If there is anything that we don't cover today, you can follow us up afterward and we'll be happy to help you. You can also submit questions as we go via the question and answer or Q&A button in your Zoom page there. So by all means, if something comes to mind, pop a question in. We do have some time at the end to go through those. Again, we may not get to everything, so anything that we can't cover, we'll touch base afterward and make sure you get some answers. So we will kick off with Robert. And Robert, I think you're going to give us an overview of the Higher Education Standards Framework and how some of that relates to our topic today.
Sure, but before I do that, maybe I should talk about the difference between a third-party arrangement and a transnational education arrangement. And I want to point out that there was an excellent piece in the last DVE newsletter by Claire Holmes talking about these two different kinds of things, which do intersect. So I believe that the link to that newsletter will be made available through the webinar or after the webinar. So I think of a third-party arrangement as an arrangement in which a higher education provider engages another institution to deliver its awards on its behalf. I think of a transnational operation as one where an Australian higher education provider delivers an Australian award program in an overseas location. Some TNE arrangements, transnational education arrangements, will be third-party arrangements as well. So, for example, an Australian higher education provider might come to an agreement with an organisation in an overseas location to deliver that provider's awards on its behalf. However, some transnational education arrangements won't be third-party arrangements. They will involve an Australian provider perhaps setting up its own campus in an overseas location. And a number of Australian universities have done that over the last couple of decades. So it's important to appreciate the two categories have an intersection. So some TPAs are also TNEs, but it's also important to understand that not every TNE is a TPA or vice versa. So that said, I think it's important to look at some very, very useful sources to determine what constitutes good practice with respect to both TPAs and TNEs. And the sources that I typically go to first off are those that I can find on the TEXA website. So the TEXA website has an excellent guidance note governing or pertaining to third-party arrangements. And it discusses those standards from the Higher Education Standards Framework, which providers must pay attention to when they're entering into TPAs. Also on the TEXA website is a transnational education toolkit, very, very useful for any Australian provider thinking of offering its awards itself as opposed to through a third party in an overseas location. Another important reference point are the higher education standards themselves. And there are a couple of standards that explicitly mention TPAs, and that's what I wanted to focus on mostly. At 7.1 and 7.2, where the standards talk about information and representation of institutions, there are some fairly clear requirements as to what providers need to do with respect to TPAs. And there's an explicit mention of TPAs at 5.4.1 and 5.4.2. But the really important message is that because in TPAs, students are doing the awards of the primary provider, and they are the students of the primary provider, then all of the responsibilities for compliance with the Higher Education Standards Framework fall upon the primary provider with respect to those students to whom delivery is through a third party. So particularly all the academic governance requirements. Also worth saying that a very clear requirement is that the policies that pertain at the primary institution with respect to the delivery of higher education need to pertain at the partner institution as well. So there needs to be a very clear alignment of policies, or the partner provider needs to explicitly just use the policies of the primary provider. So maybe I'll leave it at that, but there's a lot of information in easily accessible sources about what we should be paying attention to if we're thinking about third-party arrangements or transnational education.
Fantastic. Thank you, Robert. And I can see Ina, who's helping us, is sharing some of those links there in the chat. So for anyone online looking for those, they will be in the chat. And as Robert said, we'll send those around afterward as well. So we'll move on to some of these things in practice. So I'm interested in some of the best practices for establishing and maintaining successful partnerships. I feel like that's what everyone here today will be interested in hearing about. I'd be interested, perhaps Meredith and Robert, to begin with, could you share some examples of best practices that you've seen for audits and reviews of third-party agreements?
You want to kick off, Meredith?
Yeah, happy to. I would say that my experience is very much more from the actual operational level. So while I have been involved at academic board and looking at the policies and procedures, a lot of what I've done has been at that actually implementing it and making it happen. And probably in terms of best practice, there's two things that I think are critical. Communication. There has got to be really clear communication, but within each organisation and between the organisations, of who's who and who needs to be directed for things. And there has to be a champion at both places to be that key contact. And there could be two. There could be the strategic level and then the operational level, but there has to be that champion there for it. And the other thing is, yes, the policies and procedures are nice at that higher level, but when you come to operationalising it, it's the details that count. And you can't, well, maybe I'm a bit anal with it, but you can't beat actually documenting those. And then having a discussion between the third party and the university, make sure that you've covered everything and give them some input as well, so that you're both coming up with, if you like, your operating procedures rather than that higher level policy and procedures, so that it is clear to everyone. And one of my little bugbears, I think it's from having taught research for so long, is be specific. I mean, when the policy might say, and there will be reviews, that's great, but how often? And who's going to do them and what's going to be in the reviews? And it's that detail that, if it's discussed and documented, will solve a lot of issues, rather than a random statement about we will do reviews. I might leave it there, Robert.
Can I just jump in there too? What Meredith said is absolutely 100% important. And part of that process of documenting those operational SOPs, if you like, and procedures, is also having real clarity about the outcome measures of success. So if you're going to review, what does a successful partnership look like, and what are the metrics around that? And a lot of the strategic discussions at both institutions will be around student numbers or dollars, but we all know as educators that there are a lot of other metrics that need to be factored into these arrangements as success measures that ultimately will result in, you know, revenue, but they're more nuanced than that. And the strategic negotiations often forget that level of minutiae, but that's where the success comes from, is if the attention is paid at that level.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Jane's comments and Meredith's comments. I guess what I'd like to add is that best practice, good practice even, starts at the very beginning of the process. So I think good practice is something that requires an institution to seriously interrogate the reasons that it wants to establish either a TPA or a TNE. It needs to seriously ask itself why it's doing this and whether there is some other way of achieving the same goals. So there might be good reasons. An institution that wants to operate in a particular location overseas, who's scanned the jurisdictional landscape, the legal landscape, might discover that there are legal impediments to setting up their own operation, for example. And so they might decide that the sensible way to engage with this particular overseas location is through a third-party arrangement. Typically, I think providers who get into third-party arrangements are driven by the thought that it will generate revenue and that the revenue will be allocated between the third-party partner and the primary institution in a way that results in a net profit for the primary institution. And I think maybe Jane was getting at this point in some of her comments. One thing that also is part of good practice here is very, very carefully working through the finances of the arrangement and ensuring that all of the costs involved are actually taken into account before any decision is made, either with a TPA or a TNE. Due diligence in terms of the character of a prospective third-party partner is also very important in terms of good practice at the very outset. So you need to be confident in the ability and the standing and the reputation of the organisation you're going to partner with to deliver your programs in a way that doesn't cause you reputational damage, doesn't lead you to some kind of regulatory compliance misfortune. So I think there are cases around the country where, had there been that kind of due diligence into the nature, the character of a prospective partner, institutions wouldn't have gone ahead and would have found themselves maybe in a more comfortable situation than they're actually in, having gone ahead. The comments that Meredith made about being very sure to be precise in policies and procedures and to document the way they play out at third-party locations or transnational locations, that's incredibly important. And what it highlights, I think, is how good practice in both TPA and TNE arrangements really requires you to think carefully about how academic governance and academic oversight will play out. So very often there is a tension that develops between the economic objectives of these kinds of enterprises and the academic governance requirements that are very, very clear in the higher education standards framework. So my view is that you should take no risks with the academic governance side of things. Make sure that you've got an academic governance and academic oversight structure that's going to be effective. Don't cut corners on that in order to save a bit of money and see a better bottom line, because in the long run, you won't see a better bottom line.
Thank you, everyone. And I guess just zeroing in a little bit more on that question, any tips around effective ways to coordinate and maintain those good relationships with the stakeholders? Are there any practices or strategies around that that you've seen work well?
Well, the ones I've been involved with, it really helps if you're face-to-face on occasion and you're not relying on phone or Zoom or emails, because things can get very misinterpreted. So it's fantastic to actually go and visit and be there and get to know the operational people, and similarly for them to come on campus so they get to know the university and the people they're dealing with. Because if you've had a face-to-face relationship, the Zooms and the phone calls work much, much better, has been my experience.
I completely agree with Meredith, and the visits give you context. So there can be nuances of ways of doing business or ways of working in countries that you just can't understand or even anticipate until you're physically there, immersed in their environment, and suddenly you can see potential problems before they happen, but you can also then understand why perhaps they do things in a certain way or want to do things in a certain way. And it gives you the opportunity then to really explore how to negotiate or flex your systems and procedures to accommodate some of those if it is a contextual thing. But if you haven't been there, you just don't understand, and that can cause miscommunication, cause frustration, and things end up in a mess.
Yeah, and it's not just the staff to staff communication, it's talking to the students at the third party provider, and where they've come from and what their issues are. That gives you a much deeper understanding, as Jane was saying, of maybe why things might be done slightly differently or resources used in a slightly different way.
And it helps, as Meredith said, to bring them to your campus or your university, because they then get the context that you're operating in as well. So trying to explain to them why some things have to be done a certain way, they don't necessarily see that. But if they can sit with you and see how your governance works and why things have to be the way they are, that helps with their understanding as well.
I think as Meredith and Jane say, communication is incredibly important. And it's important not just in the ongoing playing out of the relationships, it's important in the setting up as well. I think you need to be very clear about expectations at the beginning. You need to make sure that a prospective TPA partner, for example, really understands what your expectations are, and you need to understand what their expectations are. And another thing that I thought of when Meredith and Jane were making their comments was that there's a communication problem sometimes within an institution that's engaged in one of these relationships. There's a communication problem between executive or senior management and the people who actually have to make it work. A lot of these decisions are driven top down. Somebody in executive might champion the idea of a third-party arrangement, for example, and there's a bit of a discussion, bit of due diligence, a decision is made, and a particular faculty or a school finds itself embroiled in this very, very interesting kind of relationship that maybe it wasn't exactly expecting. So in situations like that, I think communication between the people who make these things work in the school or faculty level and the senior university managers or the executive needs to be very, very good. An executive in particular need to understand the coalface issues that might drive academic staff and other staff a little bit crazy in trying to make things work.
Yeah, that internal communication is critical. And even when, programs are delivered across multiple divisions, schools, faculties, whatever it is, that cross-communication is critical to ensure that each division, school or faculty is handling things in the same way. Because things can get out of hand if each area is treating things differently. So that internal communications is really important too.
And I think one of the things that often will highlight, Robert alluded to it earlier, is that sometimes the executive decision makers, when they see these opportunities, don't fully appreciate that there are often additional resource requirements to really make these arrangements hum and work well. And they're sort of hidden resource requirements in that you might need a couple of dedicated administrators to actually manage the flow of information and paperwork and so on and so forth. And it's not feasible in most institutions to just add that to other workloads of other staff around the place. They kind of have to be specialists, really, that understand not only the individual relationship, but also all of these potential issues so that they can problem solve. And if you don't have that really clear upwards, sideways communication happening within your institution, you can often be left with frustrated staff who are trying to make these things work, and they can't, because there just isn't enough hours in a day. And that's where a lot of them will fall over, is because they're not adequately resourced.
Yeah. Just a thought that I had when I was defining a third-party arrangement, I focused on the third-party partner delivering a course on behalf of the primary provider. But in a lot of third-party arrangements, it's worth saying that other functions are in effect outsourced to the third-party partner. For example, in a lot of these relationships, the third-party partner is involved in student recruitment. In some cases, they're responsible for making offers. In some cases, they're even empowered to issue COEs. So there's a whole range of functions in addition to the core academic function that need to be thought about and decisions made with respect to whether you allow the third-party partner to perform those functions. There are certain functions which, if you allow them to perform them, I think elevate risk. So I'd be very loath to empower a third-party partner to make judgments about admissions, for example.
Yeah. I think one of the things I really liked in the TNE toolkit, there's a nice little matrix where they've got all the criteria, the institution, the third party. And you could link it to the standards and virtually go through the standards and, standard one on admission. What's the partner going to do? What are we going to do? And break it down that way. And you're ticking off that you're actually considering all of the standards and who's responsible for what, and a link to the relevant university policies and procedures. And I think that's a really good starting spot to think through everything in terms of when you're setting up those agreements.
And I mean, whatever you empower the third party to do, you need to have a really effective mechanism for oversight of what they do, for monitoring what they do, for reviewing what they do, and for being able to intervene with corrective action where you see that there is a need for corrective action.
Yeah. And I think that also brings us to the point where these agreements very rarely have well thought out exit strategies and exit clauses. So, going in, you really need to also think about how do you get out if it does all fall apart. What are some of the milestones or flags or markers, and then who's responsible for what happens to the students. There's costs involved. There's a whole lot of divorce proceedings that really need to be factored into a good contract.
That's right. And there's a lot of reputational risk at stake as well around exiting from these kinds of arrangements.
And look, I think you've led yourselves nicely into the next point, which is around some of those operational issues that can arise through these agreements. Any examples, thoughts, probably at the more operational level, but yeah, also Robert, anything from a strategic level that you see around some of the issues?
Well, I'd be interested in hearing what Meredith and Jane have got to say about one in particular, namely the engagement of staff by third-party partners. I mean, I think that's a real pain point.
Yeah, it is. And I think the first question you've got to do when you're looking at the third-party provider, are they TEXA accredited or are they not TEXA accredited? Because at least if they're TEXA accredited, you know they've gone through the process, they're familiar with the standards and the frameworks, and they've probably got processes in place that you can not have to have as much oversight. But if the third-party provider is not accredited by TEXA for anything, you've almost got to work from monitoring and controlling every step of the way and have something in process to quality assure everything. And staffing is a big one, academic staffing and meeting 3.2.3 and ensuring that their staff meet that standard. And what we did with our third-party arrangements very early on, there's a process. We need to approve the staffing if with the case of a provider that isn't accredited. Okay, so at least 2 weeks before delivery or between 4 weeks before delivery, we want to see the CVs of all the staff so that we can make sure. And so the first time we did it, yes, we got all the CVs and every single one was in a different format and some of them were 60 pages long and the key piece of information was on page 59 in small print. So it was like, what idiots. We got the TEXA abbreviated CV form. We added in, adapted it slightly to put in the scholarship of teaching area. That's what you've got to complete. And it's a 2-pager. It's consistent. We can quickly scan through. Yes, they're in the discipline. Yes, they've got teaching scholarship. Yes, they're AQF +1 or there's a policy. Tick, you're done. And then having a process where every year you have to do that to make sure that they're keeping up with their scholarship area. So you very quickly learn from mistakes of, and the closer you can get it back to the standards to make sure it's quick and easy. Even things like cohort monitoring and wanting a report on the cohorts. If they're not accredited, they're part of our Board of Examiners as a cohort and they have to go through our processes. But if they are TEXA accredited for something, they've got their own examination process and maybe you don't have to monitor that as closely as the non-provider. So there's a couple of points there where you can have more or less monitoring and control. But even with people that are TEXA accredited for something, you've got to have that monitoring, quality assurance. They've got to be providing those regular reports on those key things so that you can be assured that they are ticking all the boxes.
Yeah.
And this is really critical because if you haven't thought through simple things like the templated CV, as Meredith said, you end up with a nightmare until you suddenly go, oh, hang on a minute, why don't we do this? So having spoken to people that have done this before and some of those ideas does make life a lot easier. But then you also need some processes around what happens when they don't provide you with anybody that's qualified to teach a class and you've got 20 students about to start, and what do you do in that situation? And there's a range of things you can do, but you have to have thought of that before you get to that point so that you can quickly put that into place and make sure that you're maintaining the standards and servicing the students without having to allow someone with a degree in dentistry to teach strategic marketing. So it's really important to pre-think about those things.
Yeah, that's correct.
And we've all had that happen. And
Yeah.
the CVs are late, they don't have someone there. And once they're teaching the course, it's also important to do some monitoring of their performance with the students. So, being able to also touch base, if you can, with the students around the performance of those people, because just because they're qualified doesn't actually mean they're very good teachers either.
Yeah, I mean, the primary provider is going to have policies and procedures around student feedback. They have to have those. And they've got to apply at the third-party location. So those same mechanisms whereby you get feedback from students have got to be available to your students who are being taught by the third-party provider.
And this is also where it's important to have those central points of administrative contact, because then your academic staff who are overseeing some of the courses or programs can feed back through any feedback they have on student performance, on communication, all those things, so that that's all coming into one central place to then be put into those performance reports, rather than having that scattered by faculty or by program across the university separately.
And something has to happen as a consequence of what shows up in those reports. They can't just be reports that somebody looks at and no action takes place. Those kinds of reports, I think, really need to somehow filter their way up to an academic governance body, like academic board, or a subcommittee of academic board, like a learning and teaching committee. And actions need to take place as a consequence of what those reports say.
And that's where that building in to the performance metrics of the original agreement, if the third-party provider is not performing according to the required governance or assurance standards, then there are things that can be done at the agreement level, not just at the student and the program level.
Yeah.
And look, while we are just talking about the reporting, I have seen a question that's popped up here, which I might just ask quickly while we're on the topic. So Standard 5.4 makes specific reference to the delivery on behalf of the Australian HEP. Operationally and pragmatically, what does delivery mean / include? Consequently, to undertake a QA or compliance audit against 5.4 in relevant aspects of 7.1 and 7.2, what are the critical key controls that should be assessed that would demonstrate effective risk management and compliance? Big question.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think of delivery as the teaching. So, and you could ask the same question about what is teaching, but it's the teaching of the primary provider's course in some way or other, in some mode or other. It might be face-to-face, it might be online, it might be some kind of flexible delivery. So that's what I think delivery is constituted by, the offering of a course or a program by the third-party partner. And I think that in terms of auditing third-party relationships, you can't just look at 5.4.1 and 5.4.2. You have to look at the whole set of higher education standards set out in the framework. So even though it's just the standards that I gave the numbers for at the very beginning that explicitly mention third-party delivery, many more of the standards are applicable. All the standards to do with academic governance, academic oversight, academic quality, learning and teaching, staffing, they're all applicable. So to audit the quality of relationship, you're going to have to look at all of those standards.
I love the catch-all at the end of 5.4.2 that basically says, with all relevant standards of the HESF that relate to the arrangement. So you're back to looking at, that initial setup of going through every single standard and saying, well, university's going to do this, nothing for you. We're doing this, you're doing that. So that one applies. And it will, every relationship will differ in which of the standards just the university looks at, or that the third party has some input into. So you've really got to look at all of them at the beginning to be clear on that.
Thank you. So moving on to, and I think this is touched on, around mitigating the risks and ensuring compliance with international standards. Interested in any good examples, best practices you've seen on how institutions have managed this? Any good examples anyone can put forward? Robert?
No takers.
Okay.
They're all rushing to give you good examples.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there are good examples, but I think maybe the more important thing is to think about what would constitute good practice. So I guess the starting point is to ask what international standards we're talking about. So standards that are certainly applicable where an Australian institution is involved are the higher education standards set out in the HESF. But if you're operating in overseas jurisdictions, there might be other standards as well. And if you're delivering certain courses that have professional accreditations, like accounting or business, if a business school is AACSB accredited, or if the course is accredited, let's say, by the Australian Computer Society, you need to take account of all the standards, no matter from where they are derived. And you need to do the kind of thing that Meredith was talking about earlier. You need to make a list of the standards that are applicable. And for each one of them, you need to be very clear about how they are going to be met, who's going to be responsible for meeting them, how you demonstrate or assure yourself that they're being met. So I think the answer to the question is really what you need to do is be very, very specific and very, very methodical and very, very careful, and ensure that all of the standards, no matter from where they derive, that impact on what you're doing are going to be manageable. They're going to be met. That would be my answer anyway. And I guess I've dodged the question. I haven't pointed to any particular case, but I think that
there are some really good relationships out there that have been quite long term. And the ones I'm thinking of, it's the long term says there's been a good relationship there where, you know, there's been a lot of good communication, typically with larger organisations that perhaps have a lot of years of experience behind them in doing this type of thing, and who are been through the TEXA process, they're familiar with the standards, and they have the good processes in place to do cohort monitoring and exam boards and what have you, and have a track record, which goes back to that initial due diligence of looking at for both parties. What's the experience? What's the relationship? Are there some good long-term relationships around?
And what is the I guess the intent on both parties about the arrangement? You know, are we in the business for the same reason, and do we want the same kind of outcomes from the business arrangement? And I think Robert alluded to that initially when he was talking about your due diligence around the character and the reputation of the organisation. You know, we see I've had lots of examples where relationships have started off quite well and been quite successful, but there's been a change perhaps in the government of an international partner, and they've changed some of the education policies and procedures, which has changed, I guess, the focus of that party and partner and what they're trying to achieve with the relationship, which ultimately led to a complete breakdown of the arrangement. So, you know, you have to both be trying to achieve the same things for it to be long-term successful.
I mean, I guess everybody's loath to name particular organisations. We don't want to do that. But I think that, for example, if you look at some of the things that Australian higher education providers have done in Malaysia, you'll find some good examples there.
Yeah.
So they're certainly out there.
And thinking a little more around multiple agreements, does anyone have good examples or good practices around managing multiple agreements and some of the complexity around that?
I think so. I've worked at the University of Southern Queensland. It has over many years had many arrangements with partners all over the world concurrently, and hasn't done particularly well with a lot of them long term. Some of them it has, but the biggest factor that caused some of the failings was that lack of prioritization of a central point of management with experienced, well-resourced teams who could foreshadow or anticipate potential challenges and head them off before they happened, or alert people to how to actually deal with them. So the multiplicity of arrangements isn't what really caused the problem. It was the multiplicity of expectations with different types of partners at different programs in different countries. And that's where the challenge really came in, and that lack of priority about real experts to help manage that.
Yeah, and I guess there's a reluctance on the part of institutions to properly resource those functionalities that are going to make multiple relationships work well and effectively. And particularly if the key motivator of the primary provider is to make a profit, and for better or for worse, that's often the motivation. There's going to be a reluctance I think, on the part of the primary provider to make the upfront and ongoing investment to ensure that the relationships work well. And I think if you've got one relationship, it's not so difficult. But when you start adding to them, the work mounts up. And as Jane, I think, implied, different relationships work in different ways. They have different needs, they have different dimensions. And there needs to be a realistic understanding on the part of those who hold the purse strings at the primary provider that investments need to be made to make these work well.
And that's often impacted by changing senior staff. So, for a number of years, it might all run really well, and then you'll get a change of VC, DVC, they change. They then obviously often feel they have to do a complete strategic review. They change their priorities, and suddenly you don't have that support or investment in that management function, and then things will start to suffer. So if institutions want longevity in these relationships, it really has to be maintain priority in the strategic plan and vision, so that it is resourced long term and it is seen as a key priority.
That's right.
Now, just one of the questions, I'm going to phrase this a little bit differently to how it's been asked, so hopefully it makes sense. Interested in how participants could stay across any trends from different countries, particular cohorts or areas that might be causing some problems. Are there sources of information, places that people can stay up to date with what's happening there, and perhaps areas to steer clear of?
I think it's really useful to network with colleagues at other institutions. I don't think there's obvious official sources of information. Occasionally there might be, but I think the best source of intelligence about those kinds of questions comes from networking with colleagues across a range of institutions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Maybe Meredith have got a comment or two to add to that. I can see Meredith smiling. And too.
Yeah, it is about the networks. And I mean, there's an again, it gets back to your goals and what you want to achieve as well, and it gets back to where the competition is, and where there might be somewhere that's fairly untapped, that there's potential there, but there's so much that, especially with those countries, looking at the ones where it's going to be a good fit. Yeah. And that you've got the resources to handle that. And I know an example at UniSC, very early, there were a lot of European connections, and 20, 30 years ago, there weren't many other places operating in Europe. Yeah. And they were a great source of some good relationships, not necessarily really more exchange students and programs like that. But it was great. And there were the types of cultural issues that you might have weren't as there was opportunity costs were less, because you were dealing with a cohort of students that their English was fairly good. They were similar type cultures. They fitted in quite easily, so you didn't have to have the resources so much as students coming where it's a second language and the culture is extremely different, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's part of that due diligence piece. So where you get a closer cultural fit and a closer alignment of educational standards and educational literacy, you find that you have less of some of those other risk areas because you're similar in the way you think and behave. The students kind of have similar expectations. So, it can be a little bit easier. Where there is that difference, it's really that's where it's really important to get that contextual understanding. So to physically be on the ground. And even though we're talking about higher education providers, you kind of have to get a sense of the country's education system generally, because that's what's setting the foundation and groundwork for those tertiary education students. So if their fundamental education system is completely different to ours, you need to kind of understand that before you go in, because there might have to be some mediation work, some preparatory work, or even some management of expectations, so that you're actually all talking the same language, not speaking different languages to each other.
Makes sense.
Just a couple other things that occur to me if I've got time.
Yeah, we have around 7 minutes to go. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to pop them in. But yes, Robert, by all means.
So one thing that often happens with third-party relationships, particularly where they involve the third-party partner in a recruitment function, is that the third-party operation vampires the primary provider's operation. So students who would have come to the primary provider directly to their own campuses end up going to the third-party location. And I think that's something that isn't thought about enough in the decision-making that leads up to setting up these kinds of relationships. Very important question to ask. And another area where there's a lot of tension arising in third-party relationships is around visa risk. So, and this is again when the third-party partner is involved in a recruitment function. So the primary provider might be interested in minimising visa risk. One way of doing that is by having pretty tough requirements with students who come from particular countries, reflecting DFAT's current risk attitude to those countries. The third-party partner might be invested in securing more students from those particular high-risk, high visa risk countries. So I think there needs to be an understanding on the part of the two parties involved, just how that's going to play out, just how that's going to be handled. And again, that's not something that I think is frequently thought about when these relationships are set up.
Thank you, Robert.
And just based on that too, I was thinking we had a very good partner in Sri Lanka who provided really good students, and they were, very keen. It was a good relationship. Then the government fell over and there was civil war, there was some natural disasters, and the students couldn't continue. But we didn't really have any contingency for that in our arrangements, and we were trying to help students who not only didn't have any money because the whole country fell apart, but also didn't have anywhere to live. They didn't have any access to electricity because there were floods and there were cyclones and all those sort of things. And you can't always, preempt those things. But some countries, I suppose, may be more predisposed to crisis kind of things that you might want to think about in some contingency planning before you get into those arrangements. Other countries are less perhaps prone to not only natural disasters, but political change as well.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. And last question, very quickly. Very good question from the crowd here. So, from your experience, what do you think third-party partners would say about working with Australian institutions? What can we think about in how we approach things from the partner's perspective? And just conscious of time, we do only have 5 minutes, so perhaps summarise thoughts on that point.
It's worth saying that some third-party partners are Australian institutions. I don't really know how to answer that question simply and succinctly. I think that a lot of third-party partners are going to find the relationship frustrating, particularly if expectations aren't managed at the very outset, if expectations aren't very clear and mutually accepted at the outset. So yes, I can imagine a lot of frustration on the part of some third-party providers.
And I think it basically, a lot of what we've been talking about goes both ways. That the third-party provider wants to know exactly where the goalposts are, and what the rules are, and what the key performance indicators are, and what the relationship's going to be. And I think a lot of things apply both ways.
No,
And
that's
I know they get very frustrated when there are personnel changes with the Australian institutions, particularly if there are admin roles. People get seconded or move or leave, and then the relationship isn't well handed over, and they get quite frustrated in those cases.
Yeah, that's a good point, Jane. So, you know, a good practice from my perspective is I used to say that someone had to know what I did if I got hit by a bus. But I thought that was a bit depressing, so I changed it to if I won lotto and walked out the door. So it was never just solely me, it was always me and a backup person, so that if my role finished, there was at least someone that was familiar and had, you know, been to orientation, had been copied on things, who could step in and take that role, because that is I know, a very frustrating issue for third-party providers.
You couldn't buy a lotto ticket together.
No.
Yeah.
No, of course.
Travel on the same plane.
And having all those procedures and policies and paperwork somewhere central, not in your head or in your own computer, so that, you know, if you do walk out tomorrow, that it doesn't just fall over.
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you so much to all of our guest speakers. For everyone who has joined, you will get some emails afterwards sending around some of those links. And we do have a checklist that we've developed at DVE that ties some of this together. We will also be offering 2 advisory sessions. So if anyone here has got questions that hasn't been answered, has concerns, wants a little bit of advice, we will be offering 2 advisory sessions to the first 2 institutions that contact us. So you can do that by return email. Once you get even the email that you got the invite on will be fine. So look, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emeritus Professor Robert Elliott, Emeritus Professor Jane Summers, and Professor Meredith Lawley. Thank you, everyone, and we'll finish there.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Carly.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.